Good afternoon, folks, and welcome back to Wilderness Wargaming. Today we're going to take a final consolidated look at all of the army rules that have been released. We're going to rank them into one of four ranks based on whether or not they seem to be the most generally strong or whether they may be a little bit more niche or perhaps a little bit more complex to employ and might be just a little bit trickier. So stick with us, and we're going to get right into it here on Wilderness Wargaming. As always, please remember to like, subscribe, comment down below, and click the notifications bell for more great content. Okay, so up front, before we get into the actual army rules, let's talk a little bit about how we're going to approach this. So first of all, we're going to look at all of the army rules in the order that they were released by Games Workshop. And we're going to place them into one of four tiers. I have an A, a B, a C, and a D tier. Now, a lot of times you see an E tier down at the bottom or an F or something like that for things that are really, really in the crapper. And sometimes you see an S tier at the top for things that are superlative or just are kind of overpowered. Right now, I'm not going to use either of those tiers for a couple of reasons. One is that without any point costs and without seeing the whole rest of the armies, we can't be 100% sure about the value of these army rules because we don't know how well they're going to interact with the rest of the army. An army rule that seems really strong might end up being weaker than you think if the points costs are very high and there are not enough units to take advantage of it. By the same token, you might have some sleepers down at the bottom that have certain hidden interactions that maybe are more powerful than they might actually appear. So I'm not comfortable saying anything is overpowered or underpowered at this time. This is merely a ranking of them in comparison to each other. And just kind of where my instinct tells me that they're going to lie. The criteria that I'm going to use to look at them are three things. One is going to be flexibility, or perhaps you prefer generality. Does this seem like a rule that is useful against most or all armies and in most and all or all situations, or does it have serious limitations on when it's applicable or against what armies it might be viable? Second of all, we're going to be looking at complexity. Is the rule very straightforward and easy to employ, or does it require a lot of thought and careful planning to get the most value out of, or is it potentially confusing? And third, we're going to look at counterability. How easily does this present opportunities for the opponent to counter it and avoid its effects, and do those counters have significant drawbacks or do they not? And fourth, interspersed in all this, we're going to be looking at the degree to which these criteria are applicable generally, or do they apply most of the time, but maybe the rule has very specific differences against certain armies just based on what that army is very likely to be like based on its past history in the game. Now, and one last thing before we hit all the armies, I'm not going to include the divergent chapters. We're only going to be looking at the general Oath of Moment rule for the Space Marines. Divergent Space Marine chapters only have detachment rules. And we're only looking at army rules. We're not looking at detachment rules just yet. And the reason I chose army rules over detachment was that there are implications that there's going to be more than one detachment type for at least some armies. And we'll probably be getting additional ones fairly quickly as the first codexes start to come out. And the other things we're not going to look at are Imperial agents, because they're not a separate army. Although it implies in the article that you could play them as that, it also specifically says elsewhere that you can't, and they don't seem to have an army rule to evaluate. And we're not going to be looking at Titans for the same reason. The only thing they do is show up as Titanic and support. Their army rule is to be a Titan. So we're not going to be taking a look at those. Other factions that have kind of been separate but not really, that we're not going to take a look at are Harlequins, because they were not given a faction focus article, and they're probably going to remain part of Craft Worlds and simply haven't been explored yet. And of course Inari, because they were treated as a type of Craft World, and it looks like they're going to remain in the same state. So let's get into it, and we're going to start right off with the very first faction that was, of course, Space Marines, and that is the Oath of Moment rule. So the Adeptus Astartes at the start of their command phase pick one unit from the opponent's army, and until the next command phase, Anytime a model from your army with this ability makes an attack that targets the enemy, you can reroll the hit roll and you can reroll the wound roll. So this is, to put it pretty straightforward, this is the fuck you in particular rule. You pick one enemy target every turn, and you just get full rerolls against that target. So this is a very general rule. It's very broadly applicable, and it gets a very high score for flexibility. If we were using a scale of, say, 1 to 5, I'd probably give this a 5 out of 5 for flexibility. For complexity, I would probably give it a 4 out of 5. I only give it a 4 out of 5 because I can see cases where poor positioning could potentially reduce its value and make it a little bit tricky to employ, or where clever positioning on the part of the enemy might make it difficult to employ it to its full effect, or make you make a hard choice about who to use it against. And finally, in terms of counter ability, I am going to give this one also a 4 out of 5. So counter ability looks like there's very little the opponent can do to counter, other than try to keep the most valuable targets in limited line of sight. Only expose them to as minimal amount of fire or melee as you can. But other than that, it doesn't seem like there's a lot you can do to counter it. So we're going to overall say this is a very strong starter, and we're going to place this one in the A tier. And if we were using, I'm not really doing a point scale here, but if we were doing it, I would say it's about 13 out of 15. Next up are the Space Marines Challengers for this edition, the Synapse rules. Now, what the Synapse does is, this has always been a thing to reflect the fact that Tyranids are hive mind, and the higher up, more powerful creatures relay psychic commands out to the lower level creatures. And generally speaking, that means that your weaker creatures that are not synapses themselves have to remain within a certain distance of their synapse creatures, or else they start to take some sort of penalty, which is varied over the years. Now, this has been a limitation on the Tyranids because obviously you can take out the synapse creatures and limit them that way, but it also prevents them from necessarily controlling the board as well as they want to. What they've got for an army rule here is the synapse, and that means that a Tyranid's unit from your army is within 6 inches or more of a synapse model in your army. It's said to be within synapse range, well, obviously, and so synapse models are in range of themselves at all times. So each time a Tyranid's unit from your army takes a battle shock test, if it is within synapse range of your army, take that test on a 3d6 instead of a 2d6. So this is going to greatly reduce the susceptibility of Tyranids to battle shock. Because even units with poor leadership, you're going to average on 3d6 10.5, so a 10 or an 11. And that will pass a lot of leadership tests. I can't think of anything right now off the top. I think it would be very hard to get an opponent into a place where a 10 would fail a leadership test. So this is going to make battle shock a very limited utility against Tyranids. So how will we rate this? Well, I would say this is very strong. It's also a 5 out of 5, like the Marine one, on flexibility, because it's going to apply basically all the time. You're always going to end up taking battle shock tests at some point as you take casualties, and being able to avoid failures in some cases is going to be very helpful. In terms of simplicity, it's going to be very simple. This is also going to be a 5 out of 5. It's very straightforward. The only complexity is measuring. So that's going to be handy. Pretty handily used. A quick measurement, and that's it. And now, in terms of counter ability, I'm going to probably only give this a 3 out of 5 because although it might not be easy to counter, it does present an obvious counter, and that's to kill the synapse creatures. If you can afford to ignore weaker creatures, you can take out the synapse models. You can instantly take the benefit of this away and inflict any other consequences that there might be on the Tyranids for not being in synapse range. So which I don't know that there will be, because I think this is the extent of the army-wide rule. But there is, at least, although the although the counter to this is not at all easy to do, because a lot of big Tyranid creatures are very hard to kill, it is very, very obvious and clear to the opponent what they need to do in order to neutralize it. So overall, I'm going to give the Tyranids an A on this. This was a little bit of a tough decision. I waffled back and forth between an A and a B for them, so maybe a B+, but I'm going to say A because I think that the whole here is really greater than the sum of the parts. This is going to provide the Tyranids with a great deal of durability against a major game effect that will close off avenues of play to certain armies and will reduce the utility of certain units that are going to, their whole thing is going to be inflicting battle shock. And especially if you're playing a tournament setting where you don't know that you're going to be playing Tyranids all the time, this could be a real problem for an army that heavily relies on that. So yeah, Tyranids are also going to be an A. I guess it's befitting that the two flagship armies both get A's, but that wasn't something I came up with in advance. Next up, let's take a look at the Chaos Space Marines. And these are the generic Chaos Space Marines, not the World Eaters or the Death Guard or the Thousand Suns. And what they have is one called Dark Pacts. Now, I really like this one because it's very thematic, and it incorporates still that slightly random element of chaos, but without giving you random effects. It only gives you random consequences, and the consequences are not too harsh. Each time a unit is selected to shoot or fight, it can make a Dark Pact. If it does, select one of the following abilities for the unit's weapons to gain until the end of the phase. Either lethal hits or sustained hits 1. Each time a unit makes a Dark Pact, after it resolves its attacks, it must take a leadership test. If that test is failed, that unit suffers D3 mortal wounds. Okay. Now, this is very, very juicy for the Chaos Marines. It allows them some flexibility to deal with either hordes or with big targets. So it's very, very strong in flexibility. In terms of complexity, this one is, I'm going to say, maybe more like a 3 out of 5. It contains a little hidden trap, and that's not just that they have to take a leadership test and take D3 mortal wounds if they fail. It's also that you have to redo this each time you are selected to shoot or fight. So if you shoot and then charge, you have to do it twice if you want the effects on both shooting and fighting. And that could potentially end up having some severe consequences for you if you roll very poorly. Now, Chaos Marines have good leadership, so that's not likely, but from time to time it will happen if you're not cautious. In terms of counter ability, I'm going to give this probably a 5 out of 5. I don't really see any obvious way to counter this. The only thing you can maybe do is weaken units so that they can't afford to suck down the wounds. But by doing that, you're weakening the unit anyhow. So that's something you want to do regardless. It isn't exactly a counter. Overall, although it kind of gives it the same score as the first two, I'm going to give Dark Pact more of a B. And like I said, these numerical scores that I'm giving out are not intended to be solid. The sum is more than the whole of the parts. So I think that it's a strong ability, very, very thematic, but it potentially could be a trap for the unwary player. All right, now moving on, next up we have the Necrons. And the Necrons have their old standby in which they reanimate. And this is very, very simple now. If your army faction is Necrons at the end of your command phase, each unit from your army with this ability activates its reanimation protocols and reanimates D3 wounds. Boom. End of story. If you have any wounded models, they regain 1 lost wound. If you have less than, they all have their starting wounds, and the unit is not at its starting strength, then 1 destroyed model is returned to that unit with 1 wound remaining. Now, one thing I didn't notice early on is this kind of Okay, so each time a unit reanimates a wound. Okay, so never mind. Yeah, this works the way I originally thought. I just was reading it a little incorrectly there. And then once it's a starting strength, nothing else happens. Okay, this is, I'm going to say, this is probably only a 4 at best in flexibility, and maybe even a 3. The reason that I say that is, although it does grant you some army-wide increases in wounds that your opponent has to deal with, it is slow. It's not a large amount of reanimation. The effect is very consistent, but it isn't doing anything for you with your units that aren't already hurt. Now, it's certainly not bad. I would love to have this, but I don't know that it is really as generally useful as it seems. It may be that a lot of times it's just not keeping up with the incoming damage, and it's really just giving you a trickle of wounds. So we'll have to wait and see that, but I'm only going to give it about a 3 on flexibility. On complexity, I'll give it a 4. You do have to read the rule carefully and make sure you are applying it correctly and in the right order. So it could be slightly tricky for new players who are new to the army or who are unfamiliar with the army if the opponent has it. I'm going to say that that's slightly tricky there. And then for counter ability, I'm going to also give it a 4. The obvious counter here is focus a unit completely down one at a time. Once a unit is destroyed, it can no longer reanimate and destroy, because it's no longer a unit in your army when it's destroyed. So overall, that gives the Necrons a little bit weaker score than the previous ones, but overall I still think it's pretty good, and I'm going to place this in the B category, much like the Chaos Marines. Next up, we have the Astra Militar. The Astra Militarum retain their army rule is their orders, and I've had to split this one up because it's kind of a long rule. Officers can issue a certain number of orders to within a friendly unit within 6 inches of that officer model to issue it to. And until the next of the command phases, it's affected by that order. Okay, so then we have 1, 2, 3, 6 different orders we could take. You can do move, 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 add 3 inches to movement, fixed bayonets, gives them +1 weapon skill. And that is not only on the charge, that's at all time. Take aim, it gives them +1 to ballistic skill. First and second rank fire. Attacks rank improves attacks of rapid fire by 1. Take cover improves the save of the model by 1, which can't give you a save better than 3, unfortunately. But you could stack it with cover, because although this is take cover, it is not the benefit of cover, it's an order. And duty and honor improves the leadership and objective control characteristics of the model in this unit by 1. Okay, now, this one I'm going to give a 5 in flexibility. You can do a lot of different things with it. You can tailor it to the unit as it's required, so each unit can have what it needs. And although none of the benefits are overwhelmingly strong, the ability to adjust them as needed is very, very handy. In terms of complexity, I'm going to say this is only a 3 in complexity. And the reason is that you're going to have to carefully position your officers. They have to be within pretty close range. And you're going to have to keep careful track of what officer has issued which orders to what units. That's something that's going to be hard for both you and your opponent to keep track of. And I'm only going to give this one a 2 in counter ability. The reason is that, like the Tyranids, it is very obvious what the counter is. Kill the officers. The difference with the Tyranids is that Imperial Guard officers are, generally speaking, going to be a lot easier to kill than Tyranid synapse creatures. Imperial Guard's officers are still just relatively low point count character models and not the gigantic, horrific monsters of the Tyranids, and often won't have the same kind of defenses or number of wounds or the amount of toughness. A lot of times they'll be, I think the vast majority of the time, they'll be toughness 3. So overall, that's going to bump the Guard down a little bit, and I'm going to say that they are probably a C, a high C, maybe a low B, but I'm going to give them a C for right now. Next up, we have the Chaos Demons. What the demons do is they demonically manifest. They they create a Shadow of Chaos. Okay, and the Shadow of Chaos depends on how many objectives that they control in the no man's land and in the enemy deployment zone, each of which can separately be in the Shadow of Chaos, and their own deployment zone is always in it. While they're inside their own Shadow of Chaos, they get +1 to battle shock tests, and if they pass the test, they regain up to D3 lost wounds. And they also have Demonic Terror, which inflicts the reverse on the enemy. It subtracts 1 for their battle shock tests, and if the test is failed, the enemy suffers D3 mortal wounds. Now, this one is, I'm going to give this one probably a 3 in flexibility. While the ability is strong, can cover large areas of the board, and it always covers their own deployment zone, which is great. It also depends entirely on controlling objectives. That means that it's going to be dependent on how the objectives are set up for the mission. If you can't easily get control of the objectives in a majority of them, then it's just not going to be as worthwhile. Or if you maybe have to have a mission where you have a lot of objectives in no man's land, that could make it harder to accomplish it as well. Now, when it's in effect, it has a great general usefulness. So we're going to keep this at a 3, but it does certainly have some conditions on it. In terms of complexity, this one, it's also probably a 3. The rules themselves are very straightforward, but again, the complexity is aggravated by different missions. Where are the objectives actually, and how do you have to adapt in order to keep this in effect in different games? Does it really match up with your game plan? Opponents with a lot of objective control can probably pretty easily counter this, which leads me to the 4th one, which is counter ability. This counter ability, I'm going to also put it a 3. I think Chaos Demons will be a fairly large model count army, and they're dangerous in melee, and it may be hard to take objectives away from them. But you can, if you can hold on to the objectives in the first place and they never take them, you can deny this to the opponent, and if you can avoid going into their deployment zone, then you can counter it. However, I have a feeling this is going to all be easier said than done, so I'm still going to leave it at a 3. That gives them up to a 9 total if we were adding up points, but again, more than the sum of the parts, and I'm going to put this one at a C. Okay. From there, let's go on to the Sisters of Battle. The Sisters retain their Acts of Faith rule that they had in 9th edition and in 8th edition, where you gain miracle dice. You get one at the start of each turn, and every time one of your Adeptus Mechanicus units from your army is destroyed, you roll, each time you gain one, you roll a d6, and that's the value of the die. And the number of ways you get it is greatly compacted down. You just get one each turn, yours and your opponent's, and then you get one from the enemy destroying your units. Basically from martyrdom. Now, you no longer get them for destroying enemy units. So this is changing how it works a little bit. Now, this is interesting in that it actually encourages you to lose units. And that leads me to how I feel about this. I'm going to kind of give this one only a 2 in terms of flexibility. The reason is you're highly tied to your die rolls on this. If you're not rolling well on the miracle dice, they're not particularly useful, and 1s are no longer auto passes on leadership tests. So the 1s have lost their usefulness. Now, there's most likely ways you can convert the miracle dice, but those are also probably going to be a limited asset, and there's going to be times when this is just not as handy. The other problem with this is that you have to lose units in order to get more of them. And that kind of runs counter to the soul detachment rule that we've seen so far, which encourages large units because the unit gets bonuses for being below starting strength and then being below half strength. And larger units are more likely to remain in those categories longer as opposed to just getting wiped and never getting the bonus. So this is going to kind of complicate army design in order to get the most out of the rule. Nevertheless, it's a 2 and not. In fact, I would give it a 1 for flexibility, except that it is very useful against any army. You always have some dice you can use, and even the ones that seem not that great, like 3s and 4s, they can be auto hits and auto wounds a lot of the time. So they still can come in handy even if they're not ideal. And even in some cases, having a pre-rolled 4 for a charge or for an advance roll can be handy as opposed to risking rolling a 1. If you know you can start at a 4, you've got a much better chance of making that far, or you need a decent advance, and it's better to take a 4 rather than risk not getting it. The middling dice can still be handy. As far as simplicity goes, this is a 4. You do have to pay attention to when you get destroyed, and you have to remember to do it every turn. It's not hard to understand. There's no problem there. The biggest problem with the simplicity, and also if you've been playing the Sisters for a while, remembering that you're only getting them for these 2 conditions now. And then counter ability, I'm going to give it a 5 on this. This is actually almost impossible to counter, because although you could, in theory, counter it by just not wiping out units, a lot of times that's hard to do, and what you're going to do, just leave the superior alive in every squad. A lot of times that just won't be practical. It'll be very hard to precisely enough control your effects to get it down to just 1 or 2 models in a unit. And when you reduce that unit down to just 1 or 2 models, they're getting the bonus to hit and wound as well from the detachment rule. So this is very, very hard to counter. This counteracts its limited flexibility with something that really kind of punishes the opponent for doing to your army what they want to do to it. So overall, I'm going to give this one a B. And that's okay. They're my main army. So I feel good about the fact that my main army is not one where I'm giving an A, and I'd have to be questioning myself. Let's go ahead and take a look at the Leagues of Votan. There was no army rule that probably needed attention more than this one, along with the army itself, which, frankly, the points nerfs just never really got this into line. But this is much more reasonable. This is what we expect to see out of an army rule. You can put up to 2 judgment tokens on an opposing unit each time it destroys a Leagues of Votan unit. The first one adds +1 to the hit roll. The second one adds +1 to the wound roll against that unit. So an opposing unit kills one of your Votan units, that unit gets a grudge token. If that same unit then kills another one, it gets a second grudge token. So the most killy units in your opponent's army are therefore likely to most likely to become vulnerable to this. Now, we can also probably pretty safely assume that there's going to be some other way to put judgment tokens on them. There was already a way that the characters could just hand out a judgment token in Votan. I am glad to see, though, that the getting a judgment token for being on an objective is gone. That was silly. And I really, really hope that I can shift the judgment token off a dead unit to another one and just never get rid of any of the judgment tokens, and they just accumulate, is also gone. That was just nonsense. But this rule is pretty well balanced, and I would say, now it's probably like the Sisters, a 2 in terms of flexibility, because you are rather beholden to opposing action. You're not going to have a whole lot. You're not going to have control over how these particular judgment tokens are handed out. Well, maybe some. I mean, if you have sacrificial units that are intended to create judgment tokens, you could gain maybe a modicum of control, but you can't really make the opponent hand them out in the way you want, or accumulate them in the way you want, because they have a choice as to how to kill that unit, or they may just ignore it. It might be that it's a tiny sacrificial unit. They recognize that and don't kill it because it'll give them a judgment token, and those take up points. So I'm going to give this a 2 in terms of flexibility. In terms of simplicity and ease of use, this is a 5. It's very simple. Your unit dies. What killed it? Okay, they get a judgment token, and it just accumulates. And in terms of counterability, that's a 5 also. It's essentially impossible to counter. At some point, you're going to have to kill things. So there's really no way to counter this. Overall, then, I would say that the Votan is a B, a solid B. I really waffled back and forth on this one. It's got a pretty high score, but I feel like the inflexibility of it really hurts it. So it's still definitely a B. All right, moving on, we now have to look at the World Eaters. World Eaters have a very complicated army rule. So at the start of each of the battle round, you roll for Blessings of Corn. You roll 8 six-sided dice, and then you use them to activate up to 2 Blessings of Corn from the Blessings of Corn list. And the values are not based on totals; they're based on doubles and triples. So you have several of them. Any double, you can add 2 inches to the move characteristic. You could also, for any double, give a unit Feel No Pain 6-up. And if they already have Feel No Pain, they get +1 to whatever it is. If you have any double with a value of 3 or higher on both dice, you can give the unit Sustained Hits 1. On doubles that are with a value of 4 or higher, or any triple, each time a model in this unit is destroyed by a melee attack, okay, it's basically fight on death. You can fight on death with a double 4-up or any triple. And then on doubles 5-up or any triple, you can give any unit lethal hits on melee. And on a double 6 or a triple 4, you can advance and charge. Okay, so this one, holy cow. This one is the one that I really probably went back and forth on more than any other one. In terms of flexibility, versatility, general usefulness, this is, I'm going to say, a 4. You have a lot of great abilities there, and you can hand them out to your units as you need. And since almost all of your units are essentially melee units, any ability is probably worthwhile in any unit. Even if you can't make the ideal choice, you probably have a solid chance to put it on a good one. The only thing in terms of flexibility is that you might not easily get the one you want and have to if it's one of the higher ones and have to make a hard choice. It'll require a lot of careful thought to manage, and it's going to definitely come up with some uncomfortable trade-offs some of the time. 1 in terms of complexity. And then in terms of counter ability, I'll say a 5. It is basically impossible to actively counter this. There's nothing you can really do about it because the bonuses can be moved around from unit to unit, turn to turn, so you can never count on it being somewhere other than the most ideal enemy unit for it to be on. So there's no real way to counter it. Overall, I'm going to give this one also a B. I think it's very solid, and I think it's really flavorful for World Eaters. It's really the one that's going to be seriously a pain in terms of complexity. Okay, moving on, let's look at Adeptus Mechanicus. All right, so the Adeptus Mechanicus have Doctrina imperatives. So you can go to Protector imperative or Conqueror imperative every round. If it's Protector, all your ranged units get heavy. So they basically are +1 to hit when they're stationary, and if you get attacked within your own deployment zone with a ranged attack, the armor penetration of that attack goes down by 1. So if they're, say on turn 1, they're trying to snipe you from across the board and you're still in your deployment zone, or they're trying to take out that home objective holding unit with a long range attack, that's going to be -1 to penetrate against your unit. When you're on Conqueror imperative, ranged weapons all get assault, so you can advance and shoot. And I think assault is going to be pretty rare, so that's going to be quite good. Each time a model in this unit makes a ranged attack, if the target of that attack is within your opponent's deployment zone, improve the armor penetration characteristics of that by 1. Okay, so this one I'm going to give a 5 in terms of flexibility. You can easily pick one or the other and probably not make a bad choice. The ability to give the assault thing, the Conqueror imperative, really makes that great because assault is, I believe, pretty hard to get in this edition, and that's going to really allow you to get the movement you need to get in order to get done what you need to get done, and that's going to help a lot. I think that's probably going to be the more useful of the 2 imperatives, but it's nice to be able to switch to the Protector when you need to. In terms of complexity, I'm going to give it a 3. It's not a complicated ability on the face of it, but the choice between Protector and Conqueror could be a really hard trade-off under certain circumstances, and I could see that being an issue more often than not. If you maybe have something in your backline threatening you and you really need to weather the shooting and you want to be a Protector, but by the same token you've just got to get an enemy off an objective somewhere else, that that could be a tough trade-off. So I'm going to give it a 3 because this is not a complicated rule, but it invites complex and difficult choices in many cases. Also, the fact that it doesn't apply to melee at all, that could also complicate things a little bit because you can't really use this to affect the melee fight. And I think that actually increases the complexity of it rather than makes it easier to understand what it does, but it makes it harder to employ effectively. And then in terms of counter ability, I'm going to say this is a 4. It's not easily countered directly, but the enemy can affect it. The enemy can play around the armor penetration aspects of it by just not being in the right place for you to hit them and in their own deployment zone, or by not shooting at things into your deployment zone. So those are a little bit easier to counter than the bonus from the heavy or the assault part. I probably would have given it a 3, but it's really only half the ability that can be countered. I think I'm going to actually bump it down to a C. It's a solid ability. The deployment zone contingent aspect of it weakens it in ways that may make it hard to use in certain games, and also while the benefits are very good, you're getting a trade-off. So you're potentially only really getting one benefit out of it in a turn. You may be that the only thing you're really getting out of it is advance and shoot, or the only thing you're really getting is the +1 from heavy. And because of the game circumstances, none of the rest of it applies. So I think that makes it a little weaker than it looks on paper. So let's move on to Eldari, the Craft Worlds. Okay. Now this is one I'm very excited about. Very excited about. Strands of Fate. So you're going to roll 12d6. Okay, now this is the part where this one gets tricky. If you want to, you can re-roll the dice. But if you do, you roll one less each time, and you keep re-rolling all the dice one less time until you're satisfied with the results, or until you are down to just 1d6, in which case you have to take that single one. Now, these are going to be your Strands of Fate dice. These are like the Faith dice for the Sororitas. They're going to be pre-rolled dice, and you can use them on the typical rolls: advance, battle, shock, charge, damage, hit, save, or wound rolls. And there are ways you can get more of them. For example, you can have Guardian Defenders on an objective. They will get you Fate dice, so you're going to have Guardian Defenders, and you can change them into 6s using a Farseer. So those are normal. I'm trying not to go into the units too much, but those are kind of important. By itself, this seems a little anemic. Like, well, you're going to get 12 random dice, and some of them are going to be 1s. I don't know. Once you understand that there are ways to supply yourself with more, it looks a lot better than it is. Now, this one is a 5 in terms of flexibility. You can use it for any of these roles. You don't have to take casualties or anything like the sisters do to get them. You just have a big pool of them right from the beginning, and you can generate more. So having 6s queued up, or 5s even, at any given time is great. I mean, that's just free 6s for saves, for charges especially. It's wonderful. This is just absolutely great. And it's a far less complicated mechanic than the 9e version, which was good, but complicated. And speaking of complexity, I'm going to give this a 4 in terms of complexity. The real complexity is deciding whether or not it's worthwhile re-rolling the initial 12 dice and taking the 1 die penalty in order to take the chance of getting more 6s, or possibly getting a worse roll and having to redo it. That part could be pretty tricky, maybe even a 3 in terms of complexity. But that's also overcome by the fact that you can trade out these dice, you can generate new ones, as long as you protect your Farseer and your Guardians. And then I'm going to give this a 3 in terms of counterability, because you do have to protect those in order to get the most value out of this mechanic. This ability synergizes with certain abilities in the army very well, because you can throw 6s on things like D cannons and get the automatic devastating wounds out of it, or potentially there might be some use with fire prisms in there. Moving on, the Death Guard. The Death Guard have Nurgle's Gift, where they have an aura. And this aura subtracts 1 from the toughness characteristic of an enemy that is within contagion range. Now, it doesn't even have to be wholly within, just slightly. On the first battle round, it's 3-inch radius from all of your units. The second battle round, it's a 6-inch radius from all your units. And in the third battle round, it's a 9-inch radius from all units. And that's out from the base of the unit, or all the bases for units with multiple models. So this is a huge area. And reducing enemy toughness by 1 is very valuable. That's really going to make it a lot easier to wound tough targets. It does not seem to be limited in terms of not affecting vehicles or anything like that. It just hits everything. You do need to get close to an opponent, but it spreads out pretty good, and the size of the units themselves makes it bigger than you would think it would be. Now, the only real thing with this thing is that it's not really too great early in the battle. You're going to have to get close in the Death Guard early on, and the Death Guard is slow. Otherwise, you're just going to have to wait till later on. So for that reason, for versatility, I'm going to give it a 2. Now, for complexity, I'm going to give it a 5. It's very easy to understand what it does. There's no variability involved. There's no die rolls. There's no real thinking. It's just there. You just need to get closer to the enemy. So when it comes to counter ability, this one's going to be a 2. Now, the reason for that is that the obvious counter to this is just don't go inside the range. And, well, people might say, well, easier said than done. Yeah, if you're a melee army, easier than said than done. But if you're more mixed and have some more range, you might not have to as much. And the other thing is, melee armies, a lot of times you're going to be charging from outside that 9-inch range. Anyhow, you're going to have some way to advance and charging. You can get in there and deal most of your melee damage before they get to counterattack and take advantage of the debuff that they're putting on you. Also, because Death Guard are a Chaos Space Marine army, they're not going to have huge model counts, so it's easy to counter the expanding aspect of it by reducing the number of models on the board. So while it gets bigger in later turns, if you're killing off the Death Guard models, then you also have less sources of it. So it's kind of a you're not going to necessarily get a net increase in how much coverage you have. You might, but you might not also. Overall, this one I'm sorry to give a D to. I just don't feel like it's going to be that impactful. When you do get it, it looks more intimidating than it actually is, and there are very, very obvious ways to play around it, counter it, and deal with it. Next up, let's look at Imperial Knights. Okay, now the Imperial Knights, being a single large models, they have an interesting rule. So they have to pick an oath ability. Now you have to pick this at the beginning. You can't switch. Now, one thing that's great about this is you gain 3 command points if your army becomes honored, and this is going to be a great asset in this game because command points are going to be hard to come by, and Knights have traditionally been pretty command point thirsty. So what are we looking at here? Lay Low the Tyrant is 1. Oath ability. Each time this model is selected to shoot or fight, reroll hit roll of 1 and reroll wound roll of 1. So that's army-wide, reroll hits and wounds of 1. Great. And it's completed if the enemy warlord is destroyed. So after that, you become honored, which does a whole bunch of other things, if I'm not mistaken. And you gain 3 command points right on the spot. Awesome. Now, the other one is Reclaim the Realm. You add 1 to the move characteristic and 1 to advance and charge rolls for this model. Deed is complete if you control 1 or more objective martyrs in your opponent's deployment zone. Okay, well, this one I'm going to say I'm not a Knights player, and I don't know too much about Knights, but I think that Lay Low the Tyrant is probably a better choice here. I'm going to say most of the time I think Lay Low the Tyrant will be the play. So in terms of flexibility, I'm going to give this one a 3. It's having a hit and reroll wounds of 1 all the time. It's fantastic. So is gaining 3 command points, but you don't really have the ability to adapt that you do with some of the other ones. Complexity, I'm going to give them a 4. It's very straightforward. Once you've picked it, you don't have to manage it at all. You just have to remember your rerolls or your move bonuses, and you have a very clear condition to fulfill. The only real thing is a battle plan to fulfill it. And in terms of counter ability, I'm going to give it a 3. There's obvious counters to the 3 command point part of both abilities. It's right there in the fact, just prevent them from doing whatever the deed says. That's okay, got it. Not hard to understand what you need to do to counter. Actually, doing it against Knights may be very hard. They may be able to hose your warlord right off the field, and if they have the right plan or you have the wrong army, they might be able to just charge right into your deployment zone and get up in your grill and seize those 3 command points. And given how effective stratagems usually are on models as powerful as Knights, that could be very bad. Overall, though, I'm going to give this one a C. I think that the telegraphing of the deeds, as well as the fact that you have to pick at the beginning of the battle, and one of them seems clearly more useful than the other, really limits flexibility. We have Tau Empire. Okay. And I'm going to try to be fair to the Tau, because Tau are probably the army that I find have found the most frustrating to play against. Okay, even more so than the Votan. All right, in the shooting phase, your units from your army can work in pairs to help each other target specific enemy units. When they do this, one unit is the observer and the other is the guided unit. The enemy they are targeting is called their spotted unit. Each time you select this unit to shoot, if it is not an observer, it can use this ability. If it does, select the other friendly unit this ability is also eligible to shoot. Until the end of the phase, this is considered a guided unit, and that friendly unit is considered an observer unit. Then select one enemy that is visible to both units to be their spotted unit. So the observer, they both have to see a target. One gets to be the observer, and the other one is guided by the observer. And the guided one gets a +1 to ballistic skill, and if the observer unit has the marker light, then it gets to ignore cover. Each time a model in a guided unit makes an attack that does not target their spotted unit, worsen the ballistic skill characteristic of the attack by 1. Okay, this one is going to be, I'm going to put this one, this ability, oh my lord. Okay, this is, I think, the worst one. And I'm going to give it 2 straight across the board. And I'll explain why. Okay, the flexibility of it to work against any army is, actually, I'll give it a 3 in terms of flexibility. It works well against any army. It uses the marker light. It helps out. You can give your weaker units, make the stronger units better. So there's an incentive to take weaker units in small squads and observe. And there's even ways that I think some of the units can observe for more than one unit. But you can't daisy chain, like you can't have a single unit guide and then observe for something else. You can't do that. So you're going to have to very carefully parcel out which units you're going to use for what. Now, the obvious thing is to make all the units with marker lights the observer, so that's kind of straightforward. But if you can't always do that, you know, the terrain or whatever precludes you moving into the right position, that's going to hurt your ability to apply this. And some armies may make this really difficult to effectively employ. Also, it hurts your on-the-fly flexibility, because if you are going to shoot at something other than the observed target, like you have overkill and you would really rather shoot at something else, you're going to take a penalty on that shooting. In terms of complexity, this is going to require very careful maneuvering on the tabletop to keep this effective and not just be a nice thing you can do. And it's going to require you to protect your observer units, which are probably going to be your smaller, weaker, more vulnerable ones, because, and this leads into counterability, the obvious counter here is kill the observers. Kill things with marker lights, kill the low-hanging fruit, the easy, weaker units, and take away their observers. This one is a D for me. It's a solid D. Just don't think it's very good. I don't think Tau players should be entirely thrilled with it. But I do not. I play against Tau. I find them very frustrating. So I may not be the best person to give this opinion, but that's what it is. It's my opinion anyhow. I'm glad I'm not a Tau player after reading that. Okay, Chaos Knights. Chaos Knights have Harbingers of the Dead. Each round they start getting, well, not each battle. They get one on battle round 1, another one on battle round 3. Battle round 1, they get Despair. Enemy unit within 12 inches of yours, they are -1 on all their battle shock and leadership tests. From 3 on, it's Doom and Darkness. This gives the knight a +1 to wound against anything that's battle shocked. It gives the opponent a -1 to shoot at your knight if the opponent is battle shocked. These guys are going to mostly just be all battle shock all the time. I think that's going to be the goal of Chaos Knights for their game plan, is to try to keep battle shock on as much of the opponent as possible in order to degrade them. And this is on top of battle shock's normal effects. So, flexibility. I'm going to give it a 4. This is all quite good. But I do note one glaring hole right off the bat. It's not going to work very well against Tyranids, because they're going to have Synapse a lot of the time, and they're going to be taking those tests on 3 dice, which even with a -1 is not going to be great. So against Tyranids, I think that's going to be a weak matchup for Chaos Knights, just based on this ability. I could be wrong, but that's just looking at the army abilities. But other than that, I don't know that anything else is really going to have a whole lot of super resiliency against leadership. So I think it will be consistently effective, and it will really patch some holes for the Knights. Like if you're taking away objective control and preventing it with lots of battle shock and preventing units from holding objectives, that could be very, very handy in the scoring. Complexity. Complexity, I'm going to give it a 4 also. You just want to get close to the opponent, and you get bonuses if the opponent is battle shocked, and you want to keep battle shocked. Counter ability, a hard call on this one, but I'm going to give it probably a 3, just because faster armies are going to, or ones that can stay farther away from the Knights, are going to suffer less from this. Now, they can cause battle shock in ways other than just the Despair Aura, obviously, but if you don't need to get close to them, and there are a lot of armies that are going to shoot more and are going to want to stay farther away, and Knights are reasonably fast, but they're not super fast, and it can be doable since there's not a whole lot of them. So I am going to say that this is counterable is 3. And I'm going to give this one, though, overall, despite the rating, which was lower than you might think, I'm actually going to give this one an A. I think it's only weak to certain matchups, and although the opponent may want to stay farther away from you in some of them to avoid taking the punishment, well, they just may not be able to, because like I said, Knights are not exactly slow. We're talking 10-inch plus movement usually, well, except for the super big. I think the super big ones are 8. But also, Knights tend to have long-range weapons, so staying away from the Knight and avoiding this may not help them a whole lot. And if you're battle shocking them in some other way, you can still inflict some pain with those long-range weapons, even if you haven't done it through the Despair Aura. So I'm going to give this a solid A, because this is one where the total is truly greater than the sum of the parts, in my view. And I think Chaos Knights are going to be tough. They're going to be tough to deal with. All right, Custodians. We're getting there. Okay. Custodians, you select a kata at the start of the fight phase. So this is every fight phase. You can change it in your opponent's turn. You can use it in yours. Okay. You can have the cap. They got rid of some of the more nonsense stances. They don't have 2 different versions. This is so much simpler. Okay. Each time a melee attack targets this unit, subtract 1 from the hit roll. Dakatari. Melee weapons equipped by this unit have sustained hits 1. And Rendax. Melee weapons equipped by this unit have lethal hits. Okay, great. This is easy. This is very flexible. Are you in melee? Yes. Select a stance. Which stance should I select? Are you fighting first? If no, then select Captaris. Make them take a -1 on their hit roll. Survive to 2 your hits. Are you going second? Is the enemy large in number? Select Dakatari. Is the enemy big and tough? Select Rendax. Is the enemy neither? Pick whichever one you want. Very straightforward. This is I'm going to give this a 5 in flexibility. This is just amazingly useful. You can change it in your opponent's turn, which is awesome. So you aren't stuck in Captaris as a backstop against something that never happens, or you're not stuck in Dakatari and taking punishment you don't need to take. Really very flexible. Complexity. I'm going to give it a 5 in complexity too. I think it's a very easy choice. Are you going to fight before the opponent or not? And then if you're not, are there a lot of the enemy or are there not a lot of the enemy? That's going to tell you what to take. And sometimes you might even take Rendax when there's a lot of the enemy, because lethal hits can still stack up more wounds than you otherwise would make. I'd say take Rendax if you're not sure. And then in terms of counter ability, 5. There's nothing the opponent can really do to counter this, other than maybe interrupting in some cases and catching you a little off guard. But I don't even know how that's going to work yet. I just don't see any weakness in this. This is perfect for the Custodians. There should be straightforward, hard-hitting, and flexible, without the ridiculous spoiled for paralysis by analysis choices of the 9th edition one. That was my least favorite thing about the Custodians, was this was just such a pain to try to manage, and this is so much easier. I'm giving this an A, and if I was going to put one in an S tier, I would put this one, but I don't think the effects are strong enough, given the low numbers of the Custodians, that it will do that. But this one is, in my view, absolutely sets the standard for abilities for this edition for army abilities. I would say this one is an A+. All right, next up, Orcs. Okay, WOG. Once per battle, at a sort of battle round, you can call WOG. If you do it still in the next round, orc units from your ability are eligible to declare a charge when they advance. Add 1 to strength attacks characteristic, and everything gets a 5-up invuln. So for one battle round, you get super orcs. Very cool, very orky. Flexibility. I'm going to give this a 2. I don't see it being that flexible. A lot of times I think turn 1, you're just not going to be able to get into melee. It's going to be a waste. And I think most of the time it's just going to be, is turn 2 turning out to be a relatively light turn also, and the bulk's going to happen in turn 3? Or is it more likely that turn 2 is where you need to get into melee? You're going to go in turn 2 because you're going to want to advance and charge and get in there and start inflicting some punishment. Otherwise, you're going to start losing your army and you're just going to have fewer orcs to do this on. I think that this is very it's very obvious this is going to come right in round 2, I think about 75% of the time. This is what's going to happen. It doesn't give you a whole lot of options. Now, where its only saving grace is, it is playing to the orc strengths when it happens, and it's going to work. It's going to do what it needs to do. And it's going to give you some protection during that time too, so you can hopefully preserve the army in the later rounds. But that's it. That's its real saving graces. It doesn't seem to have any weaknesses in terms of opponents that it's not going to work all that well again. Complexity, 5. This is very easy. Pick a battle round, you have super orcs. That's it. Nothing more to say. Counter ability, 4 in terms of counter ability. Because although it's predictable, it's not really counterable. Because of the sheer number of orc units, it's hard to stay away from all of them. Stay out of that advance and charge. And if you're trying to highlight that, you're probably not inflicting a lot of casualties on them, so they can always delay till 3. I don't see a whole lot of ability to counter this other than just screening with weaker units, and in which case they're just going to get wiped out more easily. So overall, this one I'm going to give a high B. Give this one a B+2. It's really hurt by its inflexibility and the fact that it's only in play for one battle at all for one battle round of the game. But other than that, I'd say B+. Okay, next up we have Thousand Suns. Kind of dreading this one. Basically, this one, you accumulate Cabal points, and you get a number of Cabal points equal to the number in each unit's ability. So you add up how many Cabal points you have in the abilities of all your units on the table. That's what you have in your battle round. Then you can cast rituals. Got all these rituals here. So you can use 2 to get 1 reroll of a saving throw for friendly Thousand Suns unit within 18 inches. You can use 5 to get basically an extra normal move for a unit within 18 inches of the Psyker casting it. 6 of them will reduce a command point targeting that Psyker's unit to 0. 7 basically is a really powerful version of Smite. I'm sorry, 9 Cabal points. You can strip an enemy unit within 18 inches of its armor saves. Okay, well that one's the one where that's the winner right there. It's going to cost you a ton of Cabal points, and I don't think that Thousand Suns are going to have a ton of units out there. So this one's going to, well, this is the thing with this one. It's going to get weaker as the unit goes on as you lose units. You're going to be more and more limited in how many of these you can use. Let's think about this. Okay, in terms of flexibility, all solid abilities, and I'm going to give it a 4 in flexibility. The main thing is that the ability itself will actually get weaker as the army gets weaker. Not just because you have fewer units to use it on, but because the ability actually has less resources to execute with. So that's what keeps it from a 5. But otherwise, these are all awesome things. I mean, a whole free normal move, and the ability to strip armor saves, or this Doombolt Super Smite ability. That's a hard hitter. You could potentially inflict 9 mortal wounds inside. That's you could max out. That's a lot. That could take out something pretty significant. Complexity, 1. This is very complex. And it's going to involve a lot of trade-offs. I think even more than the Craft Worlds or the Sisters or the the World Eaters is. This is by far the most complex one. Even though it's easy to understand, it's going to change. It's the dynamics are going to change as the game goes on. What's going to be useful at any given time is going to change. It's really going to be very tricky to use. Now, but then again, I think that's the kind of player that would play Thousand Sons, is the kind of person who enjoys that kind of intellectual challenge. It's certainly how the Thousand Sons themselves come across. And in terms of counter ability, I'm going to give it a 4. It's pretty hard to counter. The counter, of course, is killing Thousand Sons, which will weaken it. But I mean, you want to kill the opponent's army anyhow. So I don't know how counterable it really is. It's sort of self-countering, if anything. I guess maybe we give it a 3 on that basis. There's nothing you can really do to counter it, but kind of self-counters. Overall, I'm going to give this one a C+. It's a fundamentally amazing ability, but it definitely is a thinking man's ability and requires extremely careful management. So we're going to give that one a C+. All right, next we have Grey Knights. Grey Knights have a pretty straightforward ability to understand. You get a certain number of units. It's going to be 3 in a 2,000-point game, and each turn you can basically put them into deep strike and then bring them back out again in the reinforcement step of your next movement phase. So that's it. That's nothing else. So basically, these guys can just teleport all over the place, all around the board, which allows you tremendous amount of tactical flexibility in terms of positioning, being where you need to be, to do what you need to do. Now, it's limited by the usual 9-inch limit for how close you can be to opposing units. So that's gonna a limitation on it. But this is a very good ability. It has a lot of people very excited, and I think a lot of people very worried, because abilities like this offer tremendous opportunity to play the objective game and the secondaries and get into places where you need to be. And they make it very, very hard for the opponent to screen the board out unless they have a very large number of units. So in terms of flexibility, this one is definitely a 5. It's very useful to be able to move units around the board as you please in any game. In terms of complexity, I'm probably going to say it's a 3. Because although it's very easy to understand, it is probably complex to employ. It's one with a high skill ceiling, but also kind of a high skill floor. You have to really know what you're doing with it. It's not going to be good to just pointlessly move units around all over the place. And then in terms of counter ability, it's going to be a 4. The opponent can counter it to a degree. They can screen it out in some respects, and a 9 inches is still long for a charge, so it's not as helpful for melee for the Grey Knights as it is to get into places where you can shoot. But Grey Knights have powerful units, and a lot of times they have independent single units that can maybe come into a space that the opponent couldn't quite screen easier than a larger squad would. So overall, I'm going to say the Grey Knights are an A. I think they're definitely an A, because this kind of ability to position synergizes well with the highly elite units you find in a Grey Knights army and their capabilities. Moving on. We got a couple more here. We're going to look at Drukhari. Power from Pain. You get a certain number of pain tokens at the start of the battle. It's generally going to be 3 for a 2,000-point game. And anytime you destroy an enemy unit, you get 1. Anytime an enemy unit fails a battle shock test, you get 1. Okay, so you're continually feeding them. What do you do with the pain tokens? Well, then you can give a unit at the start of any phase. You can empower it. Either give it a reroll advance or a reroll charge, depending on which phase, or you can give it reroll hits in either shooting or fight. You can hand it out to as many units as you want, as long as you have the pain tokens. This very much plays to what the Drukhari want to do, and you can very precisely target it and get exactly the bonus you want at the time you want. Its big limitation is you're going to have more units than you have pain tokens, so you're not going to be able to just throw them around willy-nilly. So for flexibility, 5. It's very precise, very targetable. You do have limited assets, but you can use it where you need to use it, when you need to use it, as long as you get it. Complexity, 3. Not hard to understand. It's mostly going to be probably some painful trade-offs of who do you really want to give the bonus to. Counter ability, I don't see a whole lot of counter. The two Two things I think are weaknesses: armies that have a hard time failing battle shock tests with Tyranids, and armies that just don't have a whole lot of units. So custodians and knights, probably gray knights, it may be less effective because you just won't get as many tokens from killing units. And also those ones are less likely to fail the battle shock test. So it is going to be somewhat counterable in the sense that if you have a way to avoid battle shock test, you can manage it a little bit. So in counterability, I'm going to give it a 4. There's not a whole lot the opponent can do about it, but if they have a way to defend against battle shock and avoid failing the tests beyond the norm, beyond just high leadership, I think that that's probably the counter. Overall, I'm going to give this one a solid B. Okay, and finally, Gene Stealer cults. Okay, well, this one, I'm going to try to sum this up briefly. When it's destroyed, you roll d6 and add +3 if it's a battle line unit. So on a 4+, it goes into cult ambush, and you can play a cult ambush marker, unless there's nowhere on the battlefield that you can place it that's more than 9 inches horizontally from enemy units. So that means you're always going to get to do this for battle line units. So other than an aircraft ends within 9 inches unit, you can bring that unit back onto the field at the location of the cult ambush marker. Okay, you don't get characters back if they're occupied or if they're attached. Okay, so this one is what it's gonna do is basically give you an endless stream of your battle line units and some of your other units back. This is very powerful because it's just constant free models coming back, and very few armies are going to be able to isolate out all your cult ambush markers. Okay, now you don't have to bring the models, the units back on the same marker that they placed. So this one is, I'm going to kind of give this one 3s in both flexibility and complexity. You have to lose stuff for it to be effective. It's basically, it doesn't do anything if you're not losing units. Now, if you're not losing units, that's good. I mean, you're probably not losing the game. But it isn't doing anything to boost it, to make you actually more effective. And I could see where it could result in just you trickling units and staying in the game, dragging the game out, but not really accomplishing anything with it. In terms of complexity, it involves some difficult choices. Now, now, here's an interesting bit, though. You don't have to bring the units back outside 9 inches from opponent unit. You can bring them back, it looks like, in engagement range, in which case I don't know if they count as having charge. It's only when you initially place the marker. In fact, by definition, you can't, because they have to end a move within 9 inches of it. So you can ambush them by coming out. You can only bring them back when an opponent is within 9 inches, the opposite of the normal rule. But there's going to be some complexity here in placing the markers, because the enemy may be able to just avoid moving within range of them if you're not careful. I think this one looks more powerful than it is right up front. It's obviously very powerful, but it is tricky. It has a lot of hidden weaknesses. And in terms of counterability, well, the counters are obvious. Park units on top, you can either just trigger them and force them to put them somewhere else in some cases, or you can avoid them. That may be easier for units like custodians or Grey Knights with not a lot of models. They may be able to easily avoid them and just not have to do that unless you put them, if they're already holding the objectives and you can't put them, they may just not want to move, and now you're kind of stuck. I don't know how this one will play, but I think it's probably not super easy to counter. Anyhow, I think I'm going to give them a C. I really think this one is fraught with trouble, hidden trouble. It's definitely got a lot of use. It's straightforward in terms of what it's got a straightforward benefit. Let's take a look at our final ratings for everything, folks. So at this point, we probably want to wrap this up. It's gone on pretty long. Unfortunately, it just takes a lot of time to get through a full rundown of the entire game in any respect. But I feel like this is kind of how things are going to play out. Our top factions, at least in terms of their army rules, this is not a prediction that these will be the dominant factions, but the ones with the best army rule that will apply regardless of what detachment they use will be Space Marines, Tyranids, Craft Worlds, which probably will include Harlequins since they never did a faction focus on them, Chaos Knights, Custodians, and Grey Knights. Now, in the middle, you're going to have two ranks, which will be most of the rest, and I think that Death Guard and Tau are going to probably get the least utility out of this. Now, themes that I think are prevalent across these are the top ones have army rules that hit hard and are very adaptable to no matter what the situation is. You're going to get some value out of them. The two at the bottom, they're there because one of them, well, both of them are highly conditional. One is highly dependent on positioning, and the other one is highly dependent on your opponent wanting to or needing to come within range, because you're a relatively slow army with a small model count. And when you have your most models on the board is when your area effect is smallest with the Death Guard. For the others, there are some in there that I think maybe could see a different call from them. Gene Stealer cults could probably be a B, for example. I could see Imperial Guard being a B. Necrons could possibly be downgraded to a C, I think. Sisters potentially could be an A, depending on other sources. I might be wrong about Drakari. They could be either a C or an A. But because we don't know enough yet to really say accurately what's going on. But I do think that these are pretty good calls and that you could make a strong case for this overall ranking. I would like to hear everyone's opinion, though. If you disagree with one or any or all of them, please let me know. Anyhow, please remember to like, subscribe, comment down below, and click the notifications bell for more great content from Wilderness Wargaming. This has been my biggest project so far. I've enjoyed doing it for you, and I hope to see you all back here very soon. Goodbye.